Thank you so much for that introduction. Thank you so much, Vicky and Pathways to Prosperity, for having us here for our talk today. So as Vicky mentioned, the title of our presentation is Opportunities and Challenges of Virtual Volunteering with Government-Assisted Refugees and Refugee Claimants. And the idea here is to kind of give you an overview of what we've experienced over the course of the last year, kind of adapting our programs and how it could maybe relate to some of the programs or work that you yourselves are doing in this space. So just as a quick agenda, I'll be speaking about kind of the before, so kind of how we've adapted our our volunteer engagement programs to a virtual environment in response to the pandemic. My co-director, Anna Hill, is going to be speaking about virtual volunteering, specifically in the context of a refugee claimant matching pilot program that we ran over the course of the last year. And then finally, our program and communications coordinator, Natasha Camo, is going to be speaking about the perspective specifically of the volunteers in our programs. So just as a bit of a background, Together Project, we've been working in this space since 2017. We're an initiative of MakeWay, and we work primarily, or historically, we've worked primarily with government-assisted refugees. And this year, as Anna will explain, we've grown in terms of the scope of our beneficiaries. But to give you a bit of a background in terms of what our Welcome Group program is, we kind of, building off the Group of 5 model of private sponsorship, the Welcome Group program connects vulnerable newcomers with 5 or more volunteers for up to and potentially beyond 6 months of social support that's tailored to specific integration priorities of each household. So as I said, since 2017, we've done this with hundreds of different families and volunteers. Some of the features of the program you'll see here on the right. We provide training and support to our volunteers over the course of their support of newcomer families. The matches are done as a group, so it's typically group to family. We provide translation and interpretation support. The program has built into it a model of evaluation and iterative learning. So every time that we do a new match, we learn from those who have, that have preceded them. We also use a preference matching system. So we try to find the best fit between our volunteers and the newcomers in our matching pool. We work closely with agency partners, settlement agencies, et cetera, to make sure that to maximize the impact that our volunteers can have in the newcomer population. And this is certainly relevant to the adaptations that we'll be talking about today. We also use online communication tools to supplement the in-person social support that we typically see in our matches. To give you an idea about these kind of specific household priorities that I mentioned, in a poll of our government-assisted refugee program participants last year, you can see here the different priorities that we saw across those different households. So at the top, every single government-assisted refugee newcomer family listed improving English as one of their household priorities. Next at the top, and this is salient to this presentation as well, is socializing and meeting new people with over 80%. And then finding employment, pursuing post-secondary education, supporting children with school and extracurriculars, and navigating healthcare. So what we mean when we say social connections and kind of, mitigating social isolation, you might be familiar with this kind of breakdown of what social connections means. Certainly in the context of our Welcome Group program, where we're introducing volunteers with newcomers to their communities, we're typically talking about building social bridges. So developing relationships between 2 different groups. And that kind of forms the foundation for the other aspects of support in our program, namely addressing other integration priorities that are a little bit more specifically related to settlement and integration challenges like language learning, navigating healthcare, et cetera. But social connections is really the kind of the glue, forming these social bridges of these matches. And that usually took place in the form of regular in-person visits, punctuated with potentially communication over online platforms. So they might use WhatsApp to kind of coordinate and schedule their meetings, but certainly most of the interaction was structured around regular in-person interaction. So, as you can imagine, when the pandemic struck last year, the immediate effect was obviously very negative for a program that's built and predicated around in-person interaction. So this is coming from a poll that we administered to our volunteers almost immediately after, I guess in late March of last year. And you can see that it had a fairly drastically negative effect on the ability of our volunteers to connect with the newcomers in their matches. So as we predicted, we realized that we had to move fairly quickly to make sure that the program was even able to function, and certainly still function effectively. We thought about this in terms of what's called an innovation cycle. So you can just see kind of a sample of what this might look like here. You know, we began with a needs assessment, kind of understanding what the actual issue is. And as you saw on the preceding graph, there certainly was one that was immediately identified. Immediately then moving to concept generation, thinking about how we can actually use this information to address this issue, researching and designing, prototyping, how do we turn those concepts and the assessment of those needs into something that could feasibly work. Then delivery and iteration. So now that we're trying it, what's actually working, what are we learning from each iteration that we're making. Scaling and systems change is something that I'd say that we're kind of in the process of doing right now. So in that initial needs assessment, when we reached out to our program beneficiaries, we kind of immediately witnessed the challenges that were kind of being highlighted by the pandemic and the lockdown measures. So shifting priorities, volunteers, you know, obviously were in pretty, potentially in pretty serious situations. Some people were losing their jobs. Some people obviously had to focus on taking care of their children at home, etc. Suddenly the context in which they were volunteering was very different. The match goalposts changed. So suddenly some of those priorities of the families, success looked very different. So how do you help with navigating education if we're shifting to e-learning? How do we help you access services if services are constantly in flux? Broken routines, some of our matches had already started. They're getting to know one another, visiting regularly, and all of a sudden that was up in the air. Technological issues. Not all of the newcomers that we work with, and certainly some of the volunteers as well, are comfortable or familiar with some of the technological platforms that the world was shifting to. Personal dilemmas, as I mentioned earlier, you know, sometimes volunteering or kind of, you know, community connection can take a back seat if something more serious is happening in your life. And just general frustration, and that is true of, you know, the response to those services being in flux or these shifting priorities, et cetera. It's not necessarily a conducive environment for forming meaningful social connections. So these challenges also gave rise to some ideas that we had in terms of how to generate some concepts to ameliorate the program and adapt. So immediately we realized that we had to define some new roles for volunteers. So what does it mean to be a volunteer in an online space when you're working with vulnerable newcomers? So for example, everything from, you know, what tutoring looks like when you're dealing with e-learning, what language practice looks like if you're doing it online and the newcomers aren't in language school. You know, forming, you know, what does regular communication look like if you can't meet in person? So it's kind of setting up those kinds of schedules. And then also setting expectations. So what's normal? What does communication look like? What does success look like in forming social connections if you're doing so online? All of this also informed how we had to train our volunteers. So reinforcing those examples and emergent learning that we were getting into our training so that our volunteers were prepared and knew what to expect as best as we could prepare them when they began getting matched online. We also shifted our processes online. So everything from how we recruited, onboarded, and trained our volunteers moved online. We had a significant leg up because much of what we were already doing was already done remotely. So certainly we were already using a lot of online communications platforms, but this certainly accelerated the need to do so more effectively and more rapidly to a point where now virtually everything that we do that's facing our beneficiaries and program participants is done online, and making sure that they're current to reflect the current realities. Also revising the criteria for participation. Online volunteering, whether you're a volunteer or an intended beneficiary, isn't necessarily for everybody. And we had to be very open and honest with potential volunteers and potential newcomer program participants about that fact. What works for some, what some people are very comfortable with, others aren't. And it was a bit of a learning curve for us to understand what the thresholds are for some of our volunteers. Some of our volunteers that were participating in our program prior to 2020, for a variety of reasons, weren't necessarily a good fit for the program as it exists online. And so we're working towards potentially thinking about what a kind of a hybrid situation might look like in the future. Likewise, some of the newcomers that we work with have priorities that aren't easily addressed or effectively addressed online. And so how can we kind of figure out a way to create a hybrid system to address their challenges as well? Also updating our resources based on needs. So everything from a dedicated page on our website around the COVID-19 situation and resources related to it, as well as updated resources for addressing some of those priorities, regular updates to our volunteers. We tried to be as responsive as possible to what the needs were. And finally, and my colleagues will speak in more depth about this, certainly, but we also had to find new tools to tell the stories of our matches and also to build communities. So kind of how can we share the stories of what we're seeing and how can we do it in a creative way that also leverages the technology that we're seeing employed in our program. So I'll leave this slide up just for a second, just to give you an idea of some of the kind of communication strategies, some of the communications tools that we created to use. Natasha will go over them in more detail, but just to give you an idea of what we were sharing with some of our volunteers. This also can give you an idea of how we kind of structured our process shift from in-person to online. And so we kind of did a bit of an inventory of all the different steps and procedures and processes in our program and thought carefully around what could responsibly be put online. And frankly, this is still a process where we're learning around, what's effective as opposed to just kind of what's most convenient, but certainly seeing, where we can kind of responsibly shift things online and what maybe needs to be still done in person or a bit more carefully. So just to kind of give you an idea of how we structured that process shift. So in terms of the next step in that innovation cycle, delivery and iteration, so we've now delivered our kind of hybrid or adapted welcome group program over the course of 2020. So we've had quite a few learnings, and certainly we've also piloted a new program that Anna's going to talk about in a moment. But in a kind of a holistic picture, just a kind of a few key takeaways I wanted to highlight were that having a built-in iteration model in our program allowed us to be super flexible because we can constantly adjust what's working. And so, again, we had a bit of a leg up in the sense that we can be very nimble and flexible. Every match that we make can be adjusted. So if we notice something didn't work with a match last week, this week we can change our process to reflect that emergent learning. We've also seen that, virtual volunteering certainly has lowered geographic barriers. So if we had newcomers who were living, in Mississauga, all of a sudden we can match them much more responsibly with volunteers who were in Scarborough, whereas previously, having an hour-and-a-half commute to visit the newcomers that you're working with wouldn't have been feasible. So those barriers have been lowered. And again, not without, serious consideration around efficacy, but it is something that we have been tapping into, the fact that online, it almost doesn't matter where you are in providing certain aspects of support. We've also seen language barriers heightened, and this is kind of feeds into the next point around the human capital profile. Some of the newcomers that we work with have very low levels of English. And obviously the language of communication for most of our volunteers is English, and language practice and language learning is certainly a key feature of a lot of our matches. Online, it's a lot harder to overcome those barriers. In person, you have things around you that can, and the use of body language that can help you to jump over some of those hurdles. But online, it's much more exacerbated, and we've seen that to be quite a challenge for some of the newcomers that we work with low language levels. And it also means that we're looking for a different kind of volunteer. The newcomer human capital profile does play a large role. So what we're seeing, and Anna will talk about this certainly from the perspective of refugee claimants, is there is a distinction between the kinds of newcomers that are well suited to virtual volunteering. And typically, as is expected, those who have higher language skills or English language skills, are better educated, are more comfortable with technology, will respond better to the program. And what we're seeing is there's definitely a distinction between government-assisted refugees who, for a variety of reasons, their human capital profile, it doesn't necessarily as often fit with the volunteers that we work with. Whereas with refugee claimants, as Anna will explain, the fit has been actually quite successful. At the same time, we're also learning about the different kinds of volunteer types and incorporating that knowledge into our matching system. So the same way that we have the same way that we've been learning about this in the past around, you know, what personality types are best fit for what kind of addressing what kind of priorities. People also have types in terms of online interaction. So who's comfortable on video, who's really good at research, etc. That all feeds into our system as well. And as you can see here on the right, this is a poll of 75 volunteers that we did in the fall. You know, in response to our adaptation to remote social support, we do see an overall satisfaction amongst our volunteers for receiving that for delivering remote social support, which we're very happy to see. I just want to very quickly touch on two success stories that speak to different aspects of our adapted program. One is the Abbott family, who was featured in a Toronto Star article in March of last year. There's a link there at the bottom. This is a really interesting story because it was, I would say, kind of a very typical match that we would have made. It actually began almost exactly before the pandemic struck. And despite the fact that you know, there's a lot of risks to that match succeeding, we saw a lot of volunteer perseverance. I mean, I encourage you all to read the article, but the volunteers really came up with very creative ways that we've since incorporated into our broader match guidance. And also we saw incredible Newcomer Resilience. So, you know, our initial fear was that the family would be really distraught, really stressed out. But as you see in the title of the article, the father certainly kind of took a very resilient approach and really was more concerned about language practice and how he's going to maintain that aspect of integration as opposed to fear around what the coronavirus represented. The second example I wanted to cite is the Alzheimer family. So this is actually an article that was just put out earlier this week. This is actually a match that we made with volunteers from TD Bank. TD Bank has been a fantastic partner over the course of the last year, both in terms of their financial support, but also in their program participation. They have an online volunteer platform that we leveraged to recruit almost 70 volunteers over the course of the last year to get involved in matches directly with newcomers in our matching pool. And this is a fantastic story that with a family of 13 in Mississauga with a TD group and how helpful they were overcoming some of the initial challenges of the coronavirus. So again, I encourage you to review that as well. I'll turn it now over to Anna, who's going to talk a little bit more about the Refugee Claimant pilot program.
Thanks so much, Andrew, and good afternoon, everyone. So my name is Anna Hill, and I'm a co-director at Together Project. I'm just going to chat a little bit about our Welcome Groups for Refugee Claimants pilot program and how we first adapted it to serve this new beneficiary, refugee claimants, and how we then adapted it again to deliver in this online pandemic context. So just to begin, one of the reasons that we decided to adapt our Welcome Group program for matching volunteers with refugee claimants is because of the large influx of refugee claimants into Toronto in 2018. In designing and delivering the program, we worked very closely with two key partners, COSTI Immigrant Services and the Crossroads Clinic at Women's College Hospital. So these two partners not only refer the refugee claimants to our program for matches with volunteers, but they also help us kind of troubleshoot and address emergent challenges as we're designing and delivering the program. As Andrew mentioned, there are some significant differences between government-assisted refugees and refugee claimants. Most notably, the refugee claimants, not all, but many have higher levels of education, higher language levels, and more professional training than a lot of their government-assisted refugee counterparts. At the same time, refugee claimants tend to have much less access to settlement services, and they're dealing with the challenge of precarious status. Next. So in terms of how we were going to adapt our Welcome Group program to serve this new demographic, we began with a feasibility study with the University of Toronto Public Good Initiative, and we actually spoke to many different refugee claimant serving agencies in Toronto to sort of determine the appropriate roles and responsibilities for volunteers. So we were talking to agencies like Neighborhood Legal Services, different clinics, and different refugee houses, as well as, you know, different refugee serving agencies. And through this research, we identified cohorts within the refugee claimant demographic that we felt were most in need of volunteer support. So first, our pilot program was focusing on single parent families. Next, refugee claimant youth ages 18 to 28. And initially we thought we would be serving refugee claimant families with low language levels. But during the program, we actually pivoted to focus on LGBTQ refugee claimant newcomers, because that was a demographic where there seemed to be a real need for social support. And I just wanted to touch on this infographic on the left. This is actually based on a 2010 report on the characteristics of welcoming communities. It's been a real touchstone for us over the last 4 years. And I think many of the characteristics within this report that we thought volunteers could address well apply to both refugee claimants and government-assisted refugees. And again, you know, in kind of defining this volunteer role, we're always thinking about how can we complement and not duplicate other services that are already being provided by different agencies in the community. Next. So in terms of specific changes we made to our volunteer training, you know, I want to emphasize for volunteers these concepts of things like trauma-informed care, culture of humility, empowerment versus charity, informed consent. All of those aspects of the training are consistent between refugee claimant and government-assisted refugee welcome groups, but there were other aspects that did need to change. So we have a strong emphasis in our volunteer training on not providing any kind of legal advice. We really emphasize that to the volunteers. And then as well, we do let the volunteers know that there's a kind of inconsistency among availability of services for refugee claimants, and that other than like an OHIP caseworker, many refugee claimants don't have kind of a dedicated agency staff person who is supporting their settlement challenges. And so what this can mean is that we really have to provide more kind of targeted support for volunteers in our matches by helping them access specific resources. And at times, we need to kind of act as a real sort of connector to agencies, Together Project staff. If a problem emerges in a match, we'll connect with either our contact at COSTI or the Crossroads Clinic, and we'll kind of troubleshoot together and then feed back to the volunteers about next steps. And if you're interested in seeing any of these training resources, I've just provided the link here. Next. So in terms of transitioning to online program delivery, one of the unanticipated benefits of working with refugee claimants is that they really are, for the most part, very well suited to digital settlement. What I mean by this is most of them have a real comfort level with technology, and because of their higher language levels, they're able to use, video platforms, digital messaging text platforms, and phone connections very effectively to connect with volunteers. I think at the same time, we do see that many refugee claimants are either, single adults or a single mother with, a few children. They're not these kind of large government-assisted refugee families. So social isolation can be an incredibly difficult challenge for many refugee claimants. So we feel like kind of the combination of connecting volunteers with refugee claimants virtually to provide this social support, but relying on these technical platforms has actually worked surprisingly well. In terms of what we use specifically, so we actually make our matches over WhatsApp text. WhatsApp is used sort of to provide on-demand support in our matches, but we like to also set up a weekly call, which is kind of the backbone of the match over the 6-month duration. And that really ensures that newcomers and volunteers can kind of build trust with that sort of weekly connection. We're also using Zoom to train the volunteers and to interview the volunteers. And then we use SurveyMonkey to do all our onboarding surveys and MailChimp to distribute resources through these monthly newsletters to all of our volunteers. And then the last thing I'd like to say about this change to online program delivery is that access to digital devices has probably been one of the biggest challenges that we faced. Particularly when kids are trying to access online learning and parents are trying to do bridging programs, and there's 1 or 2 devices per family, making sure that everyone can access the different supports that are available to them with limited access to internet or limited devices has been an ongoing challenge. Next. So, in terms of what we've learned about how best to build social connections online, again, I would just emphasize this idea that the best way to build trust is to create some predictability in the match. So now when we onboard both newcomers and volunteers, we begin by asking them before they're ever even matched, are you able to commit to a weekly call or check-in? Are you able to make this commitment over the 6-month match duration? And if there's enthusiasm for that kind of, regular weekly check-in, it's usually a good sign that the match is going to go quite well. We're aware that there are some real privacy concerns with volunteers engaging with newcomers over digital platforms. One of the things that we really encourage is that we let newcomers take the lead on when they want to transition from just connecting first by text when the actual match is made, to then perhaps a phone call, to then, towards the end of the match, many people are connecting over online video platforms. And again, some matches they're connecting by video platforms right from the beginning because they really enjoy, not just hearing each other's voices, but, seeing each other in person. Andrew mentioned a little bit about the GAR integration priorities. On the left, this diagram just shows kind of a difference among the refugee claimant demographic and the trends in the priorities among matches. So we find that 100% of our refugee claimants are asking for volunteer support with finding employment and career navigation. Next is pursuing post-secondary education. And then 46% identify socializing and meeting new people as a key priority. And then there's also, some requests to improve English and navigate healthcare. Next. So because there's, such a kind of high request for volunteer support for career navigation among refugee claimants, we're hoping to really kind of continue to develop our volunteer capacity to support refugee claimant employment. The infographic to the left is something that we've developed by watching a few matches that have just done an incredible job of supporting refugee claimant employment pathways. And we're hopeful that moving forward, there might be an opportunity for us to look into new partnerships with either, employment agencies who are interested in having some volunteer support to augment refugee claimant career navigation, or even corporate partners who are interested in some of the refugee claimants we're serving with, higher professional backgrounds, and how those kind of corporations can support those employment pathways. Another thing I want to mention is that during the pandemic, we've noticed much greater agency flexibility in including refugee claimants in career bridging programs, and this has been of great benefit to the refugee claimants that we serve. Next. Another kind of goal that we've had as this pilot has progressed is how can we really center refugee claimant voices in Together Project's program delivery and communications. And so, you know, I think we've made some real progress on this front and we're really excited about it. So the first thing that we've done is we've launched a podcast series, and we're using this podcast series to encourage any refugee claimants who want to talk about their experience working with volunteers anonymously to kind of share their thoughts in the podcast series anonymously. Another thing that we're really excited about is a lot of refugee claimants are really coming to us initially looking for volunteer opportunities. And so we always encourage them to participate in a match first as a kind of recipient of volunteer support. But several of them have completed the program and have now decided to stay engaged as volunteers. So they're now coaching refugee claimants through a 6-month welcome group experience as volunteers. And I think just the next thing that I want to say is that I think what we've really seen both through our podcast series and through you know, the incredible refugee claimant volunteers in our matches is that they're just bringing, you know, so much goodwill to Canada. And I think it's, you know, we're hoping through kind of different research studies that we'll be able to kind of capture you know, how sort of volunteer engagement with these incredibly talented and very giving, you know, refugee claimant participants can help really promote kind of positive public discourse on refugee claimant integration, arrival, integration, and settlement in Canada. Next. So I just want to quickly touch on 2 stories of match participants. So Ngozi started out in our program as a refugee claimant, and she's now a protected person. She arrived in Canada with her 3 children from Nigeria. She speaks English fluently and has a background in banking. And she was matched with this wonderful group of 6 women who she connected with initially twice a week and then once a week. And employment was a major priority for her. And, you know, over the 6-month period, she participated in several bridging programs that were run by our agency partners. And she has now just been able to accept a position at a major bank in Canada. And not only has she, you know, succeeded in kind of reaching her employment goals, but she's also just completed her volunteer training, and she'll be matched with a new household, a newcomer household in the coming weeks. Next. So Sam is another refugee claimant, a youth who was in our program. He started as a claimant and is now a protected person. He came to Canada alone from Uganda 2 years ago. And we matched him with a group of university students from the University of Toronto. He was really facing some very tough challenges: social isolation, housing challenges, employment challenges, and he faced COVID-19. And meeting the volunteers really, I think, transformed his life in many ways. And he spoke very openly with Ismaila Alpha on CBC Metro Morning about what the experience of meeting volunteers has meant for him. You can, you know, click on the link and hear the story, you know, while you're doing your dishes one night. It's a very uplifting story. And Sam is now in a cloud engineering program at Google Canada. We're super happy for him. Next. So I think overall, our refugee claimant pilot program went surprisingly well, given that there was this unexpected pivot to online matches versus in-person matches. It was a 1-year pilot that was funded by the Ontario Trillium Foundation, and we used something called the social provision scale to track a change in newcomers' self-perception of social isolation. So this was funded through the Connected People stream, and the goal was to mitigate newcomer social isolation. And you can kind of see the results to the left. I think what is kind of just this very happy outcome is that despite the move to virtual volunteering, overall, there's been a really kind of positive result across a few different metrics, social isolation metrics, of how the program has rolled out. So I think just kind of a final thing to say moving forward is that because of the success of the program, we are now continuing to match volunteers with both government-assisted refugees and refugee claimants. For the most part, our matches are, well, all of our matches are still online, but we're looking forward to seeing, how the program will evolve when some in-person interaction becomes more possible. Okay, so I'll just turn it over to my colleague, Natasha Comeau.
Great, thanks, Anna. Hi, everyone. My name is Natasha, and I am the Program and Communications Coordinator at Together Project. I will be speaking a little bit more about volunteer engagement with this new remote support model. So first of all, I'm just going to walk you through kind of the steps to become a Together Project volunteer using this infographic that Andrew showed earlier. So first of all, volunteers find us in a number of different ways, generally through Google searches, but we're also hearing that people are finding us on social media, which is great. And they sign up at our website and give us a little bit of information about themselves. So their age range, what languages they speak, what area of the city they're in, and answer a short question about, why they're interested in volunteering. And then I reach out to them and invite them to a virtual onboarding session. So we're doing this over Zoom, and I invite up to 10 people to attend a 1-hour session. So the session is both for them to understand a bit more about the program and ask questions, but also for me to get to know them a bit. So I'll ask them some questions about why they're interested, what sort of experience they have volunteering, what sort of areas of support they feel that they could best provide to newcomers, things like that. And from there, we then invite them to a training session. So the training session is also being provided on Zoom, and we do it alongside some of our agency partners. This is an opportunity for them to kind of learn tips about how best to support newcomers and hear some success stories from past matches, but also learn about important topics like trauma-informed care, empowerment versus charity, vulnerability, and more. From there, we connect them with their welcome group. So as Andrew had mentioned, volunteer groups are matched with newcomer families. So the groups are 4 or more people who work together. So if you've signed up as an individual, we'll put you into a group, but you can also sign up as a group, which many families, friends, coworkers do together. From there, within typically 8 weeks, we're able to match you with a newcomer household. And as we've mentioned, we first of all do this on WhatsApp in a text conversation. This is a gentle way to introduce a lot of new people and make it less intimidating, especially for the newcomers. People introduce themselves, and we start talking about what the next 6 months will look like in terms of the newcomers' goals, what they want to achieve, and what they're working towards. And then over the next 6 months, the household will continue to connect regularly with the volunteers, likely on a weekly call or video chat, once the newcomers are comfortable to move to a different platform. Next. So who are the volunteers? Since March of 2020, we have had over 440 volunteers sign up to volunteer with us. This is a pretty big increase from what we were previously seeing. And interestingly, we kind of broke down who these people are, and we're finding that a lot of them are young people. Almost 75% are under the age of 34. And this includes a lot of students, university students, as well as young professionals. Many of these people were either, volunteering physically at some location previously, and were then looking to give their time through a remote model such as this, or are people who just otherwise didn't have time before the pandemic and now, are spending time in the evenings at home and want to give back. We also see a large like a large variety of professions, which is fantastic because we use a preference matching model. So if we get a newcomer who, let's say, is interested in pursuing a career in engineering or nursing, we try and match them with some volunteers that have a background in that area so they can give direct advice about entering that career path and what it's like to work in that area in Toronto. Next. And then another interesting thing to note is that 50% of our volunteers have lived experience as a newcomer. So that means that they're not born in Canada, but have arrived to Canada since. And, that may mean they came when they were quite young with their parents, or, they've arrived in the last year or few months. This includes everything from immigrants to government-assisted refugees and refugee claimants. As Anna had mentioned, some of these refugee claimants are people who have already received support through the program and are now joining as a volunteer, which is fantastic. And then 19% have a family history of being new to Canada. So either their parents or grandparents, aunts and uncles came to Canada and they heard about what the process was like. All of this lived experience is very important because these individuals have, firsthand experience of what it's like to settle in Canada, and they have many life lessons to share. They can empathize and relate to the struggle of learning English for the first time, of, finding a doctor, looking for work, and share all their tips and tricks that they may have used when they were first settling in Canada. And on to the next one. So looking at the different areas of remote support, these are kind of the 6 big areas that we noticed during COVID-19 that we had to switch from the physical support to what can we be doing online. So the first thing we do is we ask the volunteers to check in regularly with newcomers. So using all sorts of online communication, both WhatsApp and video chat and phone calls, and opening it up to any sort of platform that they're interested in using. And just see how the newcomers are doing during the pandemic, make sure their questions are being answered, and make sure they're feeling comfortable and are getting the help that they need. And then socializing. So socializing is to help them alleviate social isolation. As Anna mentioned, many of the newcomers we work with are single individuals or single moms who may not otherwise have many people to chat with. So this is an opportunity for them to make some social connections, get to know one another, and even have fun together. We've heard lots of great stories of matches using Zoom to do game nights, to do book clubs, to watch movies together, to cook together, all that sort of stuff, so that way they feel much less isolated during this time. The third one there is help navigate virtual services. So during COVID, many different services have turned to become online. So that's everything from the online schooling, online ESL classes, but also like virtual doctor's appointments and virtual settlement appointments. So newcomers may need help navigating these new platforms and understanding how to get their kids set up or how to get themselves set up. So the volunteers can be there to assist them with that transition. Answering questions. So answering questions not only about, their own settlement goals and looking for work, but also around COVID-19. This has been important, especially for those individuals that have lower English levels. They may need to, be reminded of what the current restrictions are around COVID-19. As we know, the lockdown is changing quite frequently, and it's constantly changing what we're allowed to do and where we're allowed to go. So answering questions around that and around, the public health recommendations to stay as safe as possible. Practicing English. This is a great thing to do online because it can be done over a virtual Zoom chat quite efficiently. We really encourage our volunteers to do a casual conversational English practice to complement the ESL classes that newcomers are taking. This gives the newcomers an opportunity to practice in a casual setting, no pressure. They can also work on ESL homework together if they have any ESL homework they're struggling with, but it just gives them that opportunity to get more comfortable speaking the language. And then finally, sharing resources. So in addition to helping navigate those virtual services, you can also help them find resources that are moving online, like the library, online educational resources, and then, fun and entertaining things, whether that's online fitness classes, virtual museum visits, all that kind of stuff. There's lots moving online, so whatever the volunteers are finding to keep themselves busy, they may want to also share with the newcomers. Next, please. So based on volunteer feedback, here are some of the advantages we're finding of remote support. So the first would be flexibility in scheduling and the ability to even connect more frequently. So when things were happening in person, perhaps the matches were getting together once or twice a month in the newcomer's house. But now they're able to do that on a weekly basis and be in constant communication with texting as well. So, especially as more people are available in the evenings, being home, they can try and connect much more frequently. Streamlined onboarding and training. So from the time someone signs up online, they're usually in contact with me within a week and are invited to our next onboarding session. And then we're running trainings every 6 weeks. So you can actually move through this process pretty quickly and be matched with a newcomer perhaps faster than you otherwise could have. We also are seeing lots of groups capitalize on the use of online resources to schedule and share information amongst their group. So whether that's a shared calendar or a Google Drive where they're all dropping information in, that's a great resource that they can use. And then in some cases, newcomers are actually reporting more comfort with starting these connections remotely, especially if they're shy or intimidated meeting people in person for the first time. This is kind of a way for them to slowly build up trust with the volunteers and feel more comfortable to then move to a video chat, for instance. Next. And then, of course, there's going to be limits to connecting virtually. So one of them is just that, easier isn't always better, especially when we're relying on a lot of technology. So it requires both the newcomers and the volunteers to have some technical understanding and be able to connect on these different platforms. And it can be a bit difficult to adjust to this new reality. There's always going to be technological and internet challenges, people cutting out, and communication issues. And for that reason, some people find it difficult to feel connected. They may feel uncomfortable in front of a video and not feel like they're really getting to know people without that in-person connection. And then also, there's limited activities that can be done online. You can't physically be with them to show them around the city and go to museums and libraries and even help them navigate going to a doctor's appointment. Instead, you kind of have to walk them through that stuff so they can do it themselves. Of course, I've mentioned that people are getting creative with what they can do online, but there is always going to be some limit to that. And then lastly, the language barrier is more significant. As Andrew had mentioned, when you're in person, you can rely on gestures and body language to kind of read the situation and use broken English here and there. But when you're doing it all virtually and you're even using translation services, some of the meaning can be lost in that. And so we need to rely on translation in many of these instances. Next. So I'm just going to touch on 2 success stories from our program. So these are both individuals who kindly shared a bit about their match over the past year with us for our end of year video that we released last month. If you want to watch it, the link is there. On the left-hand side, this is Lou. They are a non-binary LGBTQ identifying volunteer lead, and they were matched with, along with a few other LGBTQ folks, young lesbian refugee claimant couple from Barbados. And the group actually got along really well. They shared a lot of common interests. Right from the beginning, it was a very social group. They were chatting about their shared love for dance and cooking. But the group also was really helpful in helping the couple find new housing and move in the fall. And that included looking for new furniture and getting settled in a whole new area of the city. They also helped them apply for jobs, get started at new work, and then unfortunately the couple was both laid off, so navigating going on to financial assistance. And then finally, they've also been working on helping the couple plan for a wedding next summer, which has been kind of a fun thing for them to all work on together. And then on the right-hand side, this is Paran. He is a former refugee himself and signed up for the program because he kind of wanted to give back after knowing the struggle of settling in a new, unfamiliar country. He was matched with a young refugee claimant from Uganda who was looking for some help looking for work. And throughout the match, they actually found they both have a shared love for running. So they're constantly talking about running. And in the summer, when things were a little less strict, they were actually getting together for a couple socially distanced runs together. So that was great. Next. Oh, yeah. So these are just 6 success factors that we think are most important for having a successful volunteering experience with a vulnerable population. So the first would be access to and comfort with using technology. So whether that's messaging or video chats, this is really, if you don't have this, you really can't move forward with the match. The second would be newcomers have to have, at least some ability to speak English in the match, or have a volunteer in the match who can translate for the group. So this has required us to actually do more targeted recruitment of volunteers and look for volunteers who especially speak Arabic and also Spanish. So that way, if we have families with very low English levels, we have someone in the group that can either provide translation or speak directly to them in their mother tongue. A shared commitment to the program. So both the newcomers and the volunteers need to be committed to it and regularly checking in with one another and keeping up with a schedule. This helps them build trust and make sure that everyone's on board and working together. Number 4, being available. The volunteers need to be available to answer questions and be reliable. So if you've set a time for a meeting, making sure you're showing up on time, following through with commitments you've made. And this, again, is important for building a relationship of trust where the newcomers feel like they can turn to you with questions and rely on you when you say you'll do things. The 5th is setting reasonable expectations for the group. So, at the outset of the match, making sure that you're setting goals that you can actually achieve. So rather than saying, I promise at the end of the 6 months, you'll be fluent in English and you'll have a job and all this, instead saying that we'll practice English regularly and make sure that we're trying to improve your English, and we'll, help you build your resume and make sure it's really strong so you can apply for jobs, but not making any promises that you can't necessarily follow through with. And also being realistic about what your time availability is and taking into consideration everyone's availability. So not saying we're going to talk every single day, but instead saying let's speak once a week. And then also recognizing that while you set out these guidelines and goals at the beginning of the match, you need to be somewhat flexible as things may change and priorities may change. The newcomers can become more busy throughout the match, and so we ask that volunteers are understanding and recognize that things may need to be rescheduled or may need to meet less frequently later in the match. And then the next one. So this is just some more volunteer feedback that we received from our volunteers in September. So as you can see, the volunteers generally agree that they have learned more about the challenges that newcomers face when they arrive in Canada, and that the program was an opportunity for them to make friends with newcomers. These results help demonstrate that the program benefits both newcomers and volunteers involved in the program to learn more about each other and help make settling Canada a little bit easier. And that's it.
Great, thank you so much, Natasha, and thank you, Anna. I'm just going to kind of wrap up our presentation. I see there's a few questions here that I'm sure we'll get to in just a moment by talking a little bit about some of the next steps, so kind of what all of this means for Together Project, for the Welcome Group program, where we're going. So as Anna highlighted, at the end of the pilot program with refugee claimants, we've certainly seen that it's a success. This is a population that certainly responds to this, to not just online social support, but social support more generally. We've been in the process in the past few months of kind of blending the two programs together so that there's less of a distinction, more so that we're just making sure that the correct resources are with the right volunteers, and that we can kind of continue to adapt our programming based on those learnings from the two different populations and what volunteers work best with each. Also, scaling, I know there's actually a question, I think, pending about where we do the program, et cetera. Certainly, one of the ideas around the Welcome Group program, as we've learned also in the course of administering it remotely, is that I think it's probably very applicable in a lot of different places around Ontario or Canada. And just as a bit of a background, we actually, when we first started in 2017, we actually scaled quite quickly. We were across Ontario in our first year. So we've worked in small communities like Thunder Bay. We've also worked in Ottawa. We've also worked in London in addition to the GTA. And our hope is certainly to continue doing so. We've met fantastic partners in these different cities and others that we'd love to work with. And I think that, again, the challenges that these newcomers face are not unique to the GTA. And certainly we've seen that there's a great reception for volunteers in other communities as well. So as much as we can, we'd love to find a way to kind of responsibly grow the program in a way that maintains its effectiveness and also is responsive to local needs. So if anyone who's listening is interested in potentially exploring what that might look like, please send us a message. I'll put up our contact information in a moment. And then finally, also impact and research projects. So as I mentioned earlier, we do always try to evaluate our programs, certainly in response to funders, but also in response to our intrinsic kind of impact outcomes that we're always seeking. So we're trying to kind of constantly build this into our system this year, right from the get-go, incorporating learnings from the course of the last year, and also some new work that we're doing around process improvement. So finding online platforms for us internally to track our impact and also manage our volunteers better. We want to incorporate that in the entirety of our programming and make sure that we can kind of report on that effectively to just kind of continue to find ways to demonstrate the effectiveness of the program. We're also participating in two really exciting research projects. One is with York University, studying the effect of the Welcome Group program on government-assisted refugee social capital. So that actually should be a report around that should be coming out very soon. So stay tuned for that. And another research project we're doing actually with the University of Western Ontario touches a little bit on what Natasha was speaking about, which is the effect of the program on volunteers themselves. So how this contact with a vulnerable population, this very close frontline contact, can influence and affect the community through the volunteers in terms of creating greater understanding both culturally, but also in terms of the community itself. So those are two things that we're going to be hopefully launching later this year, in addition to our own impact work as well. So with that being said, here's our contact information. Feel free to reach out with any questions, which we'll get to in a moment, or if you want to stay in touch. I'll turn it over also to our Q&A now, so we can see if there's any questions that we can address. So the top question here is, do you ever have specific matches that don't work? How do you know if they're working or not? And what do you do if they are not working? I can certainly answer that. Absolutely, there are matches that don't work, and that's actually how we can learn. And I can fill out a presentation with different examples of matches that don't work and why. Sometimes it's an issue of communication. Sometimes it's an issue of time commitment. Sometimes it's frankly on us in terms of a fit, where there might be a welcome group maybe that didn't have the right skill set to respond to a specific set of challenges laid out by a newcomer family. The main mechanism that we have to kind of constantly check as to whether or not a match is working is these regular check-ins that we do with both volunteers and newcomers, with an interpreter if necessary. We're also constantly monitoring as much as we can the communication back and forth. So for example, we mentioned earlier the fact that we use WhatsApp and other messaging platforms. So we try to monitor those just to see kind of what direction the match is heading, if there's been a lack of communication, if there's anything kind of problematic that we're identifying. But obviously, certainly before and even now with online versus in-person interaction, there's a lot that we don't necessarily see because again, the connection that we're trying to build is between volunteers and newcomers as opposed to either group with us. And so that's why we also do these regular check-ins. So with every welcome group, there's a lead volunteer. That's our main kind of point person to check in with to see how things are going, if there's any challenges. And that's also when we can identify that, it seems like someone's being unresponsive, or it seems like maybe this is a poor fit. And what we can do then is, make adjustments in terms of maybe adding a volunteer to that welcome group that maybe has a certain skill set, or rematching that family with a different group. There's a number of different levers that we can pull, and we try to be as responsive to that as possible. The next question is, what about newcomer children? Do you try to make sure that your matches have children so that they can connect? Anna or Natasha, do you want to take that one?
Sure, I can respond to that one. So I think when we were matching in person, it was really exciting actually to match families with families, because often children are better at kind of breaking the ice and getting to know each other. That they're frankly better than their adult counterparts. I think in an online context, it has been hard to kind of integrate children into sort of online video platform connections between families. I won't say it doesn't happen, but we have to be very careful about sort of when adults are interacting with kids sort of in general over online platforms. We ask that if adults in a match are assisting kids with homework in the newcomer family, that there's always at least 2 adults sort of on the video call, and ideally the parent should be in the room with the child. I think part of the reason that there are fewer kind of opportunities for like online connections between kids, I just think so many families, you know, especially among the volunteers, they're kind of trying to get their kids off screens in the evenings. So, you know, I haven't seen a lot of sort of children to children interaction online, but I'm very hopeful that when we can move back to kind of more of a hybrid model, that those in-person interactions between newcomer families and volunteer families will be a real source of glue in our matches once again.
Just to add to that, I can definitely confirm that in-person matches, you know, we consider children of volunteers kind of part of the volunteers' social network that they bring to a match. And so certainly in person, it's a lot easier when you know, if you're dropping by to visit a family for dinner, and then you're going to do some language practice afterwards. It's a great opportunity to maybe bring your children and kind of help them form that connection with the children in the newcomer family as well. But just to directly answer that second part of the question, we don't know, like, it's not necessarily a necessity in a match that we make that there's children to children being matched, but certainly we would hope that if children are a priority in that family, that we have volunteers who are either equipped to, you know, to work with children in terms of tutoring, et cetera, or who have experience in that field as well, which is really important. And then I'm just looking at the other 2 questions. So, so I think I already answered, is your program only in Toronto, or are you planning to expand to other locations? Certainly our hope and dream is to expand. I don't know, Anna, if you want to add to that, the scaling question.
Sure. I mean, we've had some really positive response from agencies outside of the Greater Toronto area. We've had some interest from an agency in Surrey, BC. And I think for us, you know, we learn so much when we work with different partners. And so our hope is that, you know, over the next 3 years, we'll be able to expand to 1, 2, maybe 3 new cities. Again, I think we've been so happy with kind of the results of the program so far. And so we feel like kind of the next step in our strategic development is to try to pilot the program in new contexts and new places.
And I just realized I skipped over the next to last question. Have you thought of using your program in smaller communities where social supports may be particularly important? What would need to be adapted for smaller communities, if anything? So like I mentioned, we did used to work in Thunder Bay, Ontario, which is, I mean, it's a city of 110 people, but certainly smaller than the GTA or any other city that we've worked in before. And we did see exactly what you're pointing out, that the social support was really much more critical there, because of the size of the city, the access to the range of services available wasn't the same as a place like Ottawa or Toronto. And so having people there to help you really meant a lot more. And so I definitely think there's a benefit to the program in smaller communities as well. It doesn't have to be, a metropolis for this to work. I think people can benefit from social support wherever they are. And in terms of those adaptations, I think, it might be a bit of a cop-out of an answer, but I think it's true of kind of any community, big or small. The idea here is to adapt it to what local resources and realities exist. So if any time that we were operating in a place outside of Toronto, we would make sure to kind of do our homework around what resources and services existed, what partners that we would be prepared to connect our volunteers to, et cetera. And a lot of that actually is kind of a co-creation of resources with our volunteers, because they obviously would know the community much better than we do. And so it's always a bit of a learning curve. What we can do is kind of build the foundation for how this interaction can kind of play out, but filling it in with, the nuances of, what's a good clinic versus a bad clinic, or what's a great local donation service that might not exist in another community. That really we rely on our community partners and volunteers to learn more about. And that's why I'll just add too, that's extremely relevant in the contrast of online versus in-person volunteering. We're actually just having a conversation about this earlier today, where, theoretically online volunteering is kind of limitless. You can volunteer kind of halfway around the world, but there is a huge value to be had to have a deep local understanding of a community, of the person who's receiving the social support. So for example, it doesn't necessarily mean you have to live on the same street as the person, but I think it really does benefit to have some understanding, or at least capacity to connect with some of those local services to make sure that the guidance and support that you're providing to a newcomer family is as relevant and meaningful as possible, as opposed to kind of having to reinvent the wheel and learn about that community yourself from a remote position. I think those are all of the questions. So I suppose that's it, unless there's any more. But otherwise, I'd just say again in closing, thank you so much for participating. It was a pleasure to share this with you. And yes, you can see our contact information there, so please do stay in touch. Anna, do you have any other final words?
No, I just really want to thank the Pathways to Prosperity team for this opportunity. And we would just be delighted to connect with anyone who wants to follow up. We know we have a lot to learn from this audience as well, so please don't hesitate to reach out.
Absolutely.